Do you think this will ever be fixed? David's voice echoed from somewhere deep within the house, as if his words weren't meant for anyone in particular. Hannah didn't respond. She stood by the kitchen window, watching the empty yard, where a gentle breeze swayed the laundry on the line. Hannah? David's voice grew louder, more demanding. She turned around, trying to appear calm, though inside she was anything but. Fix what? She noticed how his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were trying to see past her composed tone. But he just shrugged, turning his attention back to his laptop. Forget it, he muttered, and his world closed around another online conference. Hannah returned to her thoughts, clutching the cold coffee mug. Her hand trembled a bit more than usual. Fix, she repeated mentally, as if tasting the word on her tongue. Was there anything to fix? Or had her life become a series of pauses and prolonged moments of waiting? The wind picked up, slamming against the window. Hannah noticed the sheets on the line swaying. She hurried outside. Outside, the air was strangely thick, like before a storm. The sun struggled through the clouds, creating an illusion of warmth, though it was actually cool. She rushed to the clothesline, gripping the basket tighter in her hands. It's funny that you still use this, a voice sounded behind her. Hannah jumped, turning around faster than she intended. It was Mark. His voice sounded softer than she remembered. He stood by the garage, leaning against the doorframe. The light played on his face, highlighting the shadows on his cheekbones and the corners of his lips. What is? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The clothesline. In this age of technology, you still rely on the wind. There was a hint of mockery in his tone, but not malicious, more observant. Hannah couldn't help but smile, though she wished she hadn't. She returned to the sheets, feeling Mark's gaze penetrating her, as if he could see more than she wanted to show. Do you need something? She asked, focusing on hanging the laundry. Mark took a step forward. His sneakers crunched on the gravel. Just came to say hi. You're not usually the one to say just, she threw over her shoulder, but even she was surprised by her tone. People change, he replied calmly. She turned to see him looking at her with that calm yet heavy gaze she couldn't decipher. I hope for the better, she said, trying to sound confident, but her voice wavered. Mark smiled, the corners of his lips slightly upturned, but his eyes remained serious. Who knows? The wind gusted again, strong enough to knock one of the sheets off its peg and onto the ground. Hannah reached to pick it up, but the basket got in her way. Let me help, Mark said, stepping closer. His hand grabbed the sheet before hers. At that moment, their fingers accidentally touched. Hannah quickly pulled her hand away, as if burned. It's fine, she said, stepping back. Of course, his voice grew softer, almost intimate, as if he were talking about something entirely different. She felt her heartbeat quicken. This moment shouldn't have meant anything, but something within her screamed otherwise. Thank you, she said quickly, taking the sheet and returning to the line. Mark didn't respond. He stood there for a few more moments, then turned and walked back to the garage, leaving her alone with the wind and her thoughts. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking so much she could barely fasten the clothespins. Inside, David was saying something on the phone, his voice clear even through the closed door. She wanted to go in, busy herself with something to distract herself, but she couldn't. Instead, she stood by the window, watching Mark work in the garage. His movements were precise and measured, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. And then she realized her life would never be the same. Hannah listened to the sounds of the house, rolling a mug of hot coffee between her hands. David had retreated to his office, the door closing with a soft click, as if sealing her off from his world. Mark was nowhere to be seen. She tried to focus on her morning chores, washing dishes, wiping counters, but every little thing reminded her of yesterday, of how Mark's gaze had lingered on her a moment too long. Good morning, a voice came from the doorway. She jumped and turned sharply. Mark stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. His hair was slightly tousled, and he wore a simple white t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked relaxed, but there was a guardedness in his eyes. Morning, Hannah replied, trying not to show her discomfort. Mark stepped into the room and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. He held the glass in his hands as if contemplating what to say. Do you often get up this early? He finally asked. Sometimes, Hannah averted her gaze, focusing on the coffee mug. I like this time. The house is quiet. Mark nodded, taking a sip of water. Quiet is good. Sometimes. His voice was low, and she felt her heartbeat quicken slightly. He stepped closer, standing in front of her. Their eyes met, and the tension in the room became almost palpable. Hannah tried to regain her composure. How are you finding being back home? She asked, trying to sound casual. Mark shrugged. Not what I expected, but okay. Okay? She raised an eyebrow. It's tough getting used to living with Dad again. He smiled wryly. Though honestly, it's quieter here than where I was. In college? Not exactly. His gaze became thoughtful for a moment, then he shook his head as if dismissing the thoughts. You always ask such safe questions? What kind? Hannah frowned, not understanding where he was going. The ones that are easy to answer but reveal nothing, he smiled again, this time more softly. I'm just trying to make conversation, she replied, feeling the heat rise to her face. You don't have to. I like the silence with you too. Those words made her freeze. She didn't know how to react and looked down at her mug again. I think I should get to my chores, she said, stepping aside. Mark nodded but didn't leave. Hannah, his voice grew lower. She stopped, not turning around. What? Do you feel it too? Her breath caught for a moment. Those words hit harder than she expected. She turned around trying to maintain her composure, but her voice wavered. I don't know what you're talking about. He smiled as if she had said something amusing, but he didn't respond. Instead, he placed the empty glass in the sink and headed for the exit. Have a good day, he said, before disappearing from the kitchen. Hannah stood there, feeling her heart pounding too loudly. His words echoed in her head. Do you feel it too? Later that day, she tried to avoid Mark. She went to the garden, busying herself with the roses until her hands ached. But even there, in the backyard, her thoughts returned to him, to his voice, to the way he looked at her. She heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Mark approaching, holding a watering can. I thought you might need this, he said, offering it to her. Thanks, she replied, taking it, though she didn't need the water. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat down on the wooden bench by the fence and watched her. You're always so focused, he remarked. In the garden? Yes, it helps me relax. And you, Hannah? Do you relax? His question caught her off guard. I don't understand what you mean. I think you do, he smiled again. But there was something more serious in his tone. She looked down at the rose bush, trying to focus on her work. You think too much, Mark. Maybe, but so do you. Those words hung in the air between them. Hannah didn't know what to say and continued her work, hoping he would leave. But he didn't. Are you afraid of me? He finally asked. She looked up, stunned by the question. No, of course not. Then why are you avoiding me? She opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. He stood up, taking a step closer, and now they were very close. I'm not dangerous, Hannah. At least not to you. He looked at her with such certainty that she couldn't meet his gaze. She turned away, feeling her hands gripping the pruning shears too tightly. We shouldn't be having this conversation, Mark. Why not? We just shouldn't. She turned away, hoping he would take the hint. A few seconds later, she heard his footsteps retreating across the gravel. When he left, Hannah finally allowed herself to exhale. But the feeling of his presence didn't leave her. The day passed in a tense, heavy silence, as if the air in the house was filled with words no one dared to speak. Hannah tried to hide behind her routine, cleaning, cooking dinner, folding laundry. But every time she turned around, she felt like she caught Mark's gaze. By evening, she had almost convinced herself that it was all in her imagination. But when she went into the living room to turn off a light she had left on, she realized she was wrong. Mark was sitting on the couch, relaxed and leaning back. In his hands, he held a glass of water, but her attention was immediately drawn to his gaze, direct, almost challenging. Are you still avoiding me? He asked, not even trying to soften his tone. I'm not avoiding, she replied sharply, feeling her hands involuntarily clench into fists. He slowly set the glass down on the coffee table. Really? Then why do you seem to disappear every time I enter a room? Hannah took a step back, feeling his words pierce her defenses. You're imagining things, Mark. I'm just busy. Busy? His lips curled into a slight, almost condescending smile. Fine. Then why do you look at me the way you do now? How do I look? Her voice broke, and she immediately regretted asking the question. Like you're trying to decide what's more dangerous, staying or leaving. Those words hit her harder than she expected. She turned away, feeling her breath quicken. David will be home soon, she said, trying to change the subject. Great. Maybe he can explain what's going on between us since you can't. Hannah turned sharply, her eyes burning with anger, but also with something else she was afraid to admit. Nothing is going on, Mark. Do you hear me? Nothing. He stood up, now only a few steps away from her. Do you really believe that? He asked softly. I have to, she whispered, feeling her voice tremble. Mark took a step closer. She wanted to step back, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Tell me you don't feel it, he said, his voice softer, almost pleading. Mark? She shook her head, but her words stuck in her throat. Tell me there's nothing, and I'll stop. There were only a few inches between them. His presence was almost tangible, and she felt her body responding to him, despite all her efforts to fight it. We can't, she finally said, almost in a whisper. That's not an answer, he said, and his voice burned her more than any physical touch. She looked up, and their eyes met. At that moment, she knew that whatever she said next would change everything. Hannah didn't sleep that night. She paced the house, trying to drown out Mark's voice in her head. His words echoed within her, each one tearing apart her fragile barrier between desire and reason. Late at night, when the house had sunk into silence, she heard footsteps. She froze, standing by the window as Mark entered the room. You're not sleeping again, he said, his voice a mix of weariness and concern. Are you? He chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. Hard to sleep when everything feels wrong. Wrong, she repeated, turning to face him. You know what I mean. She wanted to say something, but fell silent as he stepped closer. Hannah, it's already happened. You know it. I know it. She shook her head, trying to deny it, but his words were too true. Do you want me to leave? He asked, his voice low but resolute. She looked at him for a long time before managing to say, I don't know. Mark stepped closer, his hand reaching out, touching her shoulder, then sliding down to her elbow. Then let me stay. She closed her eyes, feeling her mind scream at her to stop, but her body refused to listen. This is a mistake, she whispered. Sometimes mistakes are the only thing that make us feel alive. His words sounded like a verdict. When he leaned in closer, she didn't pull away. The silence of the house crashed around them as he touched her lips. And this time, she didn't stop him. The sun filtered through the thick curtains, creating a soft light on the kitchen countertop. Hannah stood by the sink, mechanically wiping a mug that had been clean for a long time. Her thoughts wouldn't let her go. Everything that had happened the night before felt unreal, but it was the truth. And that truth hung heavy in the air, thick as thunder before a storm. She heard the sound of a door closing upstairs, then footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat. Mark, she thought. His presence now was too tangible, as if the house could no longer contain their secret. Good morning, his voice came from behind her. She turned around. He stood in the doorway, his hair slightly tousled, his gaze calm but knowing. Morning, she replied briefly, trying to look busy. Is everything okay? He asked, taking a step into the room. Yes, she lifted the mug to her lips, though the coffee had long gone cold. Mark fell silent, and the silence in the room became almost tangible. She felt his gaze, felt him approaching her, though she couldn't make herself look at him. Are you going to act like this? His voice turned sharp. Like what? Her voice broke, despite her attempts to keep herself together. Pretend nothing happened. She turned sharply but immediately regretted it. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw everything. His confidence, his understanding. We need to forget about it, she said firmly, though her voice trembled. Really? You think it's that simple? She tried to step back, but her back was already against the counter. We shouldn't continue this, Mark. It's wrong. Wrong? Then why can't you even look me in the eye when you say that? She tried to respond, but the sound of the doorbell interrupted her. It was a sharp, almost aggressive sound that made her jump. Mark raised his eyebrows, his gaze becoming more intense. "Are you expecting someone?" "No," she whispered, feeling fear grip her chest. She walked past him to open the door. When she cracked it open, there was no one there. Just a small white envelope lay on the doormat. "What is it?" Mark asked, coming closer. "I don't know." Her voice was barely audible. She picked up the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in neat, precise letters. "I know what you're doing." Hannah felt the ground shift beneath her. "What does it say?" Mark asked, his voice low, almost threatening. She silently handed him the note. His face remained calm, but she noticed his jaw tighten. "Who could this be?" he asked, his voice cold. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. Mark scanned the empty street, then handed the note back to her. "Don't panic," he said, but there was worry in his voice. "How can I not panic?" She pressed the paper to her chest. "Someone knows, Mark. It could be a joke." "This doesn't feel like a joke," she cried out, her voice breaking. He took her hand, his grip warm and firm. "Listen to me," he said, looking her straight in the eyes. "We'll figure this out. No one will find out." "But they already know," she whispered, feeling her breath quicken. Mark squeezed her hand tighter but said nothing more. For the rest of the day, Hannah felt the weight of the note pressing down on her. Someone knew their secret, and it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of a mug of cold coffee. Over the past few days, the house had become a minefield. Every sound, every glance seemed like a warning of impending disaster. She kept the note in the back pocket of her jeans, as if that could keep her from losing control. David sat across from her, flipping through a stack of documents. His face looked tired but familiarly focused. Hannah tried to focus on him, but thoughts of Mark in the note overshadowed everything else. "Are you staying home tonight?" he asked, not looking up from his papers. Her heart stopped. "Yes, of course. Why?" "Just checking." David looked up at her. "You seem tense." "I'm fine," she quickly replied, trying not to look guilty. He looked at her for a long time, his eyes studying her face. Then he returned to his documents, saying nothing more. That evening, Hannah tried to convince herself that everything could be fixed. She avoided Mark, staying in her room with the door closed. But even behind the closed door, she felt his presence. She heard him pacing the hallway, his steps heavy and confident, as if he knew her thoughts were completely consumed by him. Later, when the house had sunk into nighttime silence, there was a knock on her bedroom door. Her heart leaped to her throat. "Hannah!" Mark's voice was low but insistent. She hesitated before opening the door. He stood in the doorway, his gaze intense. "We need to talk," he said. "Now?" Her voice was weak. "Yes, now." She didn't know what to say and silently stepped aside, letting him in. "What are you going to do?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "I don't know." She hugged herself, trying to shield herself from his questions. "Whoever left that note knows. If you keep silent, it will only make things worse." "You think I don't understand that?" Her voice exploded with unexpected force. "But what can I do? Go to David and tell him. 'Hi, dear. We have a problem. I'm sleeping with your son.'" Those words hung in the air. She wished she could take them back, but it was too late. Mark stepped closer, his face tense but calm. "I don't want you to go through this alone," he said softly. "Mark, you don't understand what you're saying." Her voice trembled. "If David finds out, he'll destroy us both." "Maybe," he shrugged, "but we can't pretend this isn't happening." Hannah looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't understand what scared her more, the prospect of being exposed or the fact that she couldn't make herself regret what had happened. The next morning, everything fell apart. Hannah woke up to the sound of a door slamming shut. Her heart stopped when she heard David's heavy footsteps in the hallway. He was home. When she went downstairs, David was already waiting for her in the kitchen. On the table in front of him lay an envelope. "Hannah, sit down," he said, his voice low but cold. She knew it was the end. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "See for yourself." Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were photographs of her and Mark, in the garden, in the kitchen. in the laundry room. Each image was incriminating. Each stripped away the masks of their relationship. "How long has this been going on?" David asked, his voice almost a whisper, but filled with rage ready to explode. She couldn't find the words. "Answer me." He slammed his hand on the table, making her jump. "It was a mistake," she finally said, her voice filled with desperation. "A mistake?" David laughed bitterly. "The mistake was marrying you." At that moment, Mark entered the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze meeting David's. "You," David said, his voice filled with venom. "You've been sneaking around with my wife?" "It's not what you think, Dad," Mark started calmly. "It's exactly what I think," David interrupted him. "You slept with my wife. That doesn't need interpretation." "Dad, stop!" Mark took a step forward, his tone sharp. "Get out of my house," David growled, his face pale with rage. Mark looked at Hannah, and in his eyes there was pain, but he said nothing more. He just turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the ruins of her life. The silence in the house was suffocating, as if the walls were absorbing the rage and pain, only to throw it back at Hannah with doubled force. After Mark left, 3 days passed. David had left for a hotel right after their last conversation, leaving her alone in a house that felt cold and empty, despite the sun streaming through the windows. She couldn't sleep. Food had lost its taste, and routine chores seemed meaningless. Hannah still heard David's words in her head, "Get out of my house." But he had left, abandoning her to drown in guilt and regret. The morning was gray. Hannah sat in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee, trying not to think about how her life had crumbled in just a few days. Her gaze wandered across the table until it stopped on a small white envelope. Another note. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The envelope was identical to the previous ones. No name, no return address. She slowly tore it open and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Did you think it was over? I see everything." Hannah felt her breath catch. She stood up abruptly, her heart racing. She looked around the kitchen, as if expecting someone to be standing behind her, but it was empty. Suddenly, the whole house felt like it was closing in on her. She rushed outside, hoping the fresh air would help her calm down. But even there, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. Hannah approached, her heart pounding wildly. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with Mark. "You! What are you doing here?" she breathed out. "We need to talk." His voice was low but tense. She hesitated but stepped aside, allowing him in. "Is David home?" he asked, scanning the empty room. He left." Her voice trembled. Mark nodded, his gaze becoming focused. "I got a note too," he said. Hannah froze. "You, too?" He nodded and pulled out an identical envelope from his pocket. "You can't hide," he read aloud. "Someone is playing with us, Hannah." She stood still, feeling panic rise. "I can't take this anymore, Mark. I don't know what to do." He stepped closer and placed his hands on her shoulders. "You're not alone in this. We'll find out who's doing this." "And if it's David," she whispered, afraid to say it out loud. "It's not him," Mark said firmly. "It's someone from the outside." "But who?" Her voice sounded almost pleading. Mark fell silent, his gaze tense. "Maybe it's one of the neighbors. Or ... Or... He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he sat down on a chair, rubbing his face with his hands. "I'll leave," he finally said. "It will be better for both of us." "No!" Hannah stepped toward him, her voice sharp. "If you leave, it won't stop whoever is doing this." Mark looked up, his face filled with doubt. "Are you sure you want me to stay?" She didn't answer immediately, but then, taking a step back, she nodded. "Yes." That night, they didn't speak any more words. Mark stayed on the couch in the living room, and Hannah went to her bedroom. But even behind the closed door, she knew he was nearby. That feeling was both comforting and dangerous. Her sleep was interrupted by the sound of a muffled thud. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. Hannah slowly made her way out of the room and went downstairs. In the kitchen, the light was on. Mark was standing by the table, holding another white envelope in his hands. "It was on the porch," he said, handing it to her. She took it, her fingers trembling. This time the note was short. You will do it again. Hannah felt her legs give way, and she sat down on a chair. This won't stop, she whispered. We'll find out who's doing this, Mark said firmly, his voice filled with determination. But deep down, she knew that the answer to this riddle could shatter them both forever.